Okay, my full name is Charles Francis Jacks. I was born August 21st, 1933. I was born in Madison County, Alabama. That would be near the little town of Newmarket.
And what about your parents? What was their occupation?
My parents were small-time farmers. And after, for all I can remember, until probably by my 8th birthday, they moved to Tennessee. I'll extract that. Well, they moved. We still was in Alabama, but we were right at the state line. And as time went on, things began to get a little better, and we moved into a big house, real nice, on the Tennessee side of the state line. And we lived there until I started to Elora School in the 2nd grade, and we stayed in Elora until I was a freshman in high school, and then I finished. That was at Huntland, Tennessee, and I graduated. That's where I graduated.
All right. And did you have any siblings?
Siblings? Yes, I had 5. I'm sorry. I had 6. I knew that, but I had 6 brothers and a sister. Okay, that'll get it right. And keep forgetting myself.
So you graduated from Huntland High School.
Well, I didn't right away. I went to grammar school at Elora, and then before we moved to Huntland, I went one year to school at Flintville, and then we moved. And I remember this, in 1949, we moved to Huntland, and I started there in my sophomore year, and continued there until I joined the Navy.
And what year did you join the Navy?
1951.
1951. So you enlisted, you weren't drafted?
No.
What made you choose the Navy?
I think it was because of my 2 older brothers that served in the Navy. I kind of, being the brat in the family, I kind of looked up to them, and that was one thing. And then, you see things that you admire, and it kind of sticks. And that was primarily the reason, I think.
Where did you receive your basic training?
At Bainbridge, Maryland. That's near Baltimore.
And where did you go from there?
From there, well, I went to hospital corpsman school there on that base at where we had boot camp at Bainbridge. And after I graduated from the school, I was transferred to St. Albans, Long Island, New York. And that was for in-hospital training on patients. That's where I learned to give shots and other things that goes along with taking care of it was a veteran hospital, and that gave me some upfront stuff with how the veterans like that had to go to the hospital. So it was quite an interesting thing.
So how did you end up in Korea?
Well, I got tired of the hospital duties, and I went to my personnel office and talked to the chief there, and I told him that I felt my dissatisfied with the work I was doing. I'd like to do something else. And he said, well, I like what? I said, well, I'd like to have a ship, or I'd like to something. And he told me he had no ship with an opening for a corpsman. But he said, and I asked him at that point, what have you got? And he said, well, the Fleet Marines. And I asked him, when can I go? And he told me, you can go tomorrow. And so I accepted that offer, and that's where I went to I went to Camp Pendleton, and we went through some combat training, which mainly it was the exercise where you learn to go under barbed wire, and you learn pretty much what the Marines done. And from that is when we went to San Diego and boarded the USS Marine Serpent to Korea.
How was your travel over?
It was rough. It was rough. First of all, the ship was confiscated. I don't know how they got it, but it was a merchant marine ship that had been modified into a troop ship. And it was not a streamlined ship like you normally think about, and it was a little rough because we had a bad typhoon, hurricane, whatever, somewhere between Hawaii and Wake Island, and it slowed our ship down to 7 knots in order to stay on course. But we did ride it out and went on. We made a tour through Japan. Went to pulled in the bay there at Kobe, Japan, and they gave us a 12-hour go to town break. And so we went from there on into Korea.
Were a lot of men sick on the ship going over?
Yeah, there were some ship sickness. Some of the big tough guys, they had calmed down. You had to stand clear of the rail.
So where did you arrive in Korea?
Well, I don't remember the exact day. I do know this, we were 21 days between San Diego and Incheon. We did land at Incheon. So, but the exact dates, I can't remember, but
Was this 1951 or 52 when you arrived?
Yeah, it was 52, 1952.
And where did you go from there after arriving in Incheon?
Well, we were put on a convoy, went up to the MLR being the main line of resistance. And that's where we stayed. They put us at a, well, I don't know what to call it. It was a camp that was kind of like a rest area for the guys that was up front, and they got relief for a few days. And that's where we were told where we would go from there. And I was assigned to, I guess I have to say, Dog D Company. But anyway, I was assigned to the Marine group, whether it be it was a small group, I'd say somewhat about the size of a platoon. And that's where we lived. We lived in whatever we could find to live in. We had a trench line that supplied us protection from incoming hardware, and we got adjusted there, and I was put in a bunker area with a radioman and one of the sergeants, one of the group leader guy, and I stayed with them for several weeks, and the corpsman was sent where they were needed. It didn't matter if it was somewhere here one day and there the next, because we did lose a lot of corpsmen by wounds and that. And so if they needed me somewhere other than where I was, they come get me and take me there. Little cheap, and so that's the way it went all through the conflict here.
How was life in the trenches?
It was tolerable. It was you knew you had a little bit of protection, and you had someone with you. You split your time a standing watch, and so it was okay.
Were you ever in any dangerous situations?
Well, yes, I was. I was. There would be mortar firing, and where they had observers just like we did, and if they saw us being our troops out milling around or doing what, you could expect 60 millimeter mortars to come flying at you, and they had some hand grenades and of course rifles like we did, but it was a cat and mouse type situation. We would go on patrols to see what was happening out in front of our main line. And of course they would sneak around where they could. And sometimes you'd get in a firefight, and sometimes you wouldn't. You'd just return back to your compound there and go back to waiting. That's really about the way it went until we were called on to raid a hill called Umgok, and it was quite a battle. We lost, I believe, 15, and of course my job was to help bandage the ones that I could. We were several wounded, and we got them bandaged up and got little Jeep ambulance or carriers that we could get them to a Jeep and get them back to field hospitals or field medical stations. And I stayed there till that was cleaned up, and then I went to a medical company this was called Dog Med, D for dog, and we were but somewhere between Seoul and Incheon, and we had sick bay there, and we had a bomb-proof, if you could say that, little hospital. We had one Korean doctor and one American doctor there that took care of the wounds that was flown in by helicopter from the front. And I stayed there until it become our time to go home, and that's when I guess we went back down to Incheon. That's where the ship we would board the ship.
As a medic, were most of the injuries you treated minor injuries, or were there really large injuries you had to treat?
Well, we treated of course, a lot of minor injuries. We had to take care of the guys if they had a bad cold, but we did take care of minor injuries. Now, when we was on the front, we had to be the first aid to the wounded or sick, but we didn't utilize the USS Haven, which was in the harbor, was a medical ship, but some of them did, depending on where their location was in the country. But we were at Dog, Ned, and that was close to the MGM River, and we received any of the sickness or hurt at that area. That's where they come to the Dog Med for treatment. We stayed there until my time to come home. Now, we'll go a little further. On our ship, the USS General Walker, they brought the war had ended at that time. It was a truce had been signed, and we were one of the first. Well, they had during the truce talks, they had made a deal to release. We would release their prisoners, and they would release our prisoners. And so they had come to join us to come home on the Walker. So we brought home on my ship. We brought home the first load. I didn't know how many there was, but I can't now. But we brought home a first load of POWs, brought them back to the state. And
did you get to speak with any of them on the ship on the way home?
no, didn't get to do that. They separated us, and I guess it was, debriefing where they wanted the prisoners. They wanted to talk to them one-on-one, and we didn't have anything to say. So really, we did have some when we got to San Francisco, but when we got to San Francisco, they let the prisoners off the ship first, and they had a big reception, a lot of TV cameras, and that was back when a lot of people didn't have TV at that time. So that was 1953, and so from there I got to come back to the United States, and there I ended up at Camp Pendleton.
When you were in Korea, I assume you spent winter months in Korea?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the weather conditions?
The weather conditions wasn't good. It was cold in the wintertime there, and got below zero a lot of times. It did snow a good bit in Korea, and we had white uniforms. Patrol would put on. It was kind of makeshift uniform, but it was white to blend with the snow. But that was the time of my service there that we went on patrols. We were hardly a night went by that we didn't go out in some direction. Sometimes we were told, try to make contact. And for that we took a tin can and a rock, go out and shake it every once in a while. So, but a lot of times we didn't make contact, and a few times we did.
What about food while you were there?
Food was C rations. Now we did at Dog Med have a makeshift kitchen of a sort, because we were lucky. We had a Marine cook that was stationed with us, and he put up a catch it on the run type chow hall, so he got a hold of some material somewhere that he could scramble eggs and do things like that, and so we did have a place we could sit down and eat something. So, but generally your food was in C rations.
Before the interview, you had mentioned a letter in your C rations.
Yeah, in a box of C rations. This one was called a salt ration. It was a bigger box, had bigger cans, and that was the reason it was called a salt was because you carried that with you when you were going out and staying maybe a couple of days before you come back in. And we found a note, a handwritten note, and it was signed by a lady, and we thought that we could find out, because we thought it was from L.A., Los Angeles, and so we few of us got together and said a few words and wrote it down, and we mailed it to her first name and to just the town of Los Angeles, because we had no way on what kind of street address or anything to put down. And we were disappointed. We never heard back from that, so we didn't know if probably, she'd moved on, and anyway they couldn't. If the Postal Service tried to find her, they didn't.
Do you remember what the letter said?
Pardon?
Do you remember what the letter from her said, the note said, that she had written?
What it said? Yeah, it said something to this effect, hang in there guys, we're pulling for you, and we'll be with you. Something of that nature. It was just a gung-ho type note.
How did it make y'all feel?
Well, we appreciated it. We said, we'd like to look her up, and when we got home, it was a plus to her personality and our ego or whatever. We had done something great there, found that note.
Did you get to send many letters home to your family?
We had no restriction on how much we could write. We had free airmail. It was picked up at airmail was picked up daily at a checkpoint and carried to wherever it was mailed from to home. But we could write any time, and we were not censored at any time I was there. And so we could communicate with our family and friends back home. I know I had wrote to a couple of my guys I played football with and basketball, and I wrote them a time or two, and some of the kids they'd talked about it, some of the other kids, that they would want to write to us. And I think at one point that they had kind of a request by somebody that to remember the guys that are in service, and so we got pretty good mail. A lot of us get more. Some of them be sad. Some of the guys didn't know a lot of people. They didn't have a history of being, they were workers. They had a job or that, but we enjoyed communicating back with their hometown.
When you first arrived in Korea, what were your thoughts? What did it look like?
Well, now this is going to be a dilly too. When we pulled into Incheon, see, Incheon belonged to the South by then. They had from the start of the war, the guys that landed there were landed there in a combat situation, but we had control, or South Korea had control of Incheon at the time I got there, and we saw. Now this is the one I get you. As we were pulling in to where they were going to dock us, off the side was this. I don't know what kind of ship it was. Kind of a cargo ship, I suppose, and it was loaded with caskets. Somebody got note of that, and they got passed around the ship pretty quick, We're like, but I thought, boy, that's not a good meeting. That's not a pleasant way to meet to get there. But we that was, I don't know. I have no idea what it was there for, but I can imagine what it was there for. But I don't know. But and that's where we just hung out until we get this ride up to the front, or close to the front. We didn't immediately get to the front, but we had a camp up there rest camp that we stayed over until it was assigned.
Was there much damage by that point?
But
when you arrived, was there much damage to the cities and towns and where people lived?
Yeah, there was a lot of sign of them, and there were trees that were damaged, that sort of thing. And of course, we didn't know how Korea looked, and of course it's not a pleasant story. Korea that I saw was rice paddies and little villages. And they have a village of one big rice paddy area would have the village kind of surrounding that rice paddy. And that was different families that had an interest in that rice paddy. That was their living. And their main staple, I suppose, was the food, was the rice. But they lived around that there, in a village type thing. You didn't see, or we didn't see any, like here, a house over here, and 4 miles down the road's another house. They all lived in close quarters. And I've talked about it some. The conditions was that their houses were thatch roofs. The walls were like what we call stucco, and they were heated in the wintertime primarily with charcoal. Charcoal bed. The floors were mud concrete, and they would have tunnels under that ground level, and they would stuff that with charcoal, and that was their heat. And it was warm. It'd heat that floor all around it. It would be warm. They did have warm homes, most of them. And
Have you been back to Korea?
I've been back.
So you haven't been back, but have you seen on the news the current conditions?
Yeah, I've seen what we've been shown probably the last year or so. I never kept up with it a lot after I got home. I was too busy trying to figure out what I was going to do, and I did go back to school. Uh, I dropped out of school my senior year, and when I got back, I went to our principal and I told him I would like to return to school and asked him if it would be feasible for me to do that. And he said they'd be glad to have us, and he told me what I had to do. He told me I had to take, I had to have certain credits and a number of credits, and he said, if you can do that, well, I'll see that you get your diploma.
Why was it important that you finished high school?
Why did I want to? Well, I was the first job I got when I got home was detasseling corn. So I wanted to at least get a diploma that because even then, if you wasn't a high school graduate, you didn't have a chance of a menial job that you would have if you were a high school graduate. And I could have gone to college on the GI Bill, but I chose to work where I could and save that for later.
So the Korea that you saw, is it a lot different from what you see today on the news?
It was.
Is it a lot different from what you see today on the news compared to what you saw back in the 50s?
Oh, goodness. Korea today is a modern high scraper country. In each of the towns, only two towns that I visited was Seoul and Incheon. But those towns now are ordinary high scraper, blacktop roads, pretty cars. It's that way now. All that I've seen on television and newsreels and that, and so they're living, especially in South Korea, are living pretty good. Now I've heard a lot of stories about North Korea, about how they work their people with very little money and very little food. It's that they have had a lot of starvation in North Korea. And
South Korea is now the 11th largest economy in the world, and you played a role in that. How does that make you feel?
well, I kind of feel good about it. They had those people have worked hard, and they deserve, I think, a chance at a decent life. Which they didn't have a decent life when I was there. The people that did the farming work and that it was a place that we would call a slum. And I felt sorry for those people, still do. But they're living well now, as best I can tell.
What are some of the lessons you learned from your time in the military? What are some of the lessons you learned from your time in the military serving in Korea?
Well, I don't know when exactly I learned it, but I knew that you had to do some things you didn't want to do, and you accepted it, and you knew you had to accept it. And I hope that what we done as a part of the United Nations is, I think it was well worth, I don't know if I should say that. We lost a lot of soldiers and a lot of Marines and a lot of sailors in that war. But I think that we can all be proud that we helped them to get that over with and them, you know, back to a normal life. It wasn't a good life.
Is there any message you would like to leave to future generations who will watch this interview?
Well, I would. There's several things I'd like to say to them. I'd like to say to be the best you can be, and whatever you do, try to do it right. Do it. There's an old saying: do it right, or do it twice. So I believe that. I believe that's a challenge, to do it right the first time. But
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
no, I don't. I don't have a lot. I would like to say that we need to. I'd like to see our country in this thing with this monkey that they got for a president in the North. And excuse me, but I wouldn't. I would tell him he was a monkey. But it's there. He's holding those people of his own in poverty while they're spending all their assets on military equipment and this nuclear thing, and his own people are going hungry. That's at least the news that I get. So I think we ought to back our government, and I think we need a whole lot less protesting than what we're having today.
All right, well, I thank you for your time.
Well, I appreciate you having me.